Welcome to this latest edition in our video interview series here at iConnect. Five questions that we ask to a scholar of public law about his or her research. My name is Richard Albert, and along with Tom Ginsberg and David Landau, I am a founding co-editor of iConnect. Our guest today is Zach Elkins, professor of government and law here at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Zach.
Hi, Richard. Nice to see you.
We could have done this in the same room. You standing.
I know. I was thinking about that, actually. Yeah.
Before we start, Zach, I want to let you know two things. The first is that you were nominated by one of our readers, viewers, to do this. So congratulations. You have N or more admirers out there.
All right. So I know who to blame. That's good. Right.
Well, I won't tell you who nominated you. And the second thing I want to note, Zach, is an anniversary that you are celebrating this year with Tom Ginsberg and James Melton, the 10-year anniversary of a pioneering work in the realm of comparative constitutional law, The Endurance of National Constitutions, published 10 years ago in 2009 by Cambridge University Press, an important book. So congratulations to you and to you and Tom and James.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, very proud of that book. So hadn't realized it had reached 10 years and now feeling old. And realizing now we should do a second edition, perhaps.
Oh,
which is actually something we thought about.
Look forward to that. And I mentioned Ron's name because you, Ron, and Tom run a series at Cambridge University Press.
Yeah, it's a competing series on comparative law to probably more prestigious one at Oxford. Even more remarkable that the two of us had those series at Texas. So that's interesting. Yeah.
We don't need to say more about that. Let's just begin. With the first question. What is it that you're researching and writing right now?
Well, I'm distracted by a number of things, but one thing that I'm working on more than most things right now is something on what I call identity regimes. And that is aspects of constitutions in which drafters actually have identified members of the society and, importantly, excluded non-members. So I'm thinking about, for example, things like official religion clauses, official language clauses, and sort of citizenship clauses that may be more or less exclusive. And so I'm looking at those. And some of this is prompted actually by some rumblings in the US to actually do away with aspects of the 14th Amendment that grant birthright citizenship. And that's actually surfaced periodically. And my thought was, well, what are some of the consequences of having this very generous citizenship policy and other aspects of a constitutional regime that might exclude people. And as you know, Richard, so much of constitutional design is bent on trying to tie members of the country together, and those are very exclusive, divisive systems. And I think to the very little success we've had in this country of binding people of different backgrounds together, I think perhaps that part of the success has to do with the 14th Amendment. So I'm looking at that, and it's actually brought on a friend and colleague, John Sides, to work on aspects of it with me.
Okay. We'll look forward to reading that whenever it's ready. Do you have a particular regime for how you write and when you write, or do you just write whenever the mood strikes and wherever you are at a given moment?
You know, it's not as predictable as some, I guess, and it could be because my life these days is more hectic with three young kids running around, and so they tend to distract me in a pleasant way. But I like to write in the morning. I think perhaps because my mind's clearest and I'm feeling most optimistic then. And the afternoon, I remember my son telling me once that 3 o'clock was his least favorite time of the day. And I've come to realize that I'm subjected to those same sort of biorhythms. And so I try to exercise or do something active in the afternoon so I'm not subject to those doldrums, and try to write in the morning. And, I don't have a specific routine, but I do like to, in some ways, adjust the ambiance in a way that sets myself up for success, or at least a happy time. I love writing, and it's fabulous, but I've been tempted by this idea of, not tempted, but interested in this idea of temptation bundling, in which you actually combine a few very pleasant things with something you need to do. So they often think of it in terms of, watching a movie while you work out or something like that. And so I definitely have some music going on, always a cup of coffee. Actually play a little bit of guitar, so I have that next to me. So I take breaks and play some guitar. But the jury's still out on writing with music. And in fact, I have a graduate student in this course I teach on writing who wrote a piece on whether people should write with music or not. And I actually put on some usually some jazz, and in particular, I have this one album, Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, that I put on all the time. And I think for me, it kind of recedes into the background, only because I know it so well. And it also provides this very predictable chunk of time, 45 minutes, that I'm going to write and then take a break and do something else. So that's my routine most of the time.
Yeah. Well, whatever you're doing, it seems to be working, Zach.
I don't know about that.
Well, when did you know that this is what you wanted to do with your life? That is to say, that you wanted to be a professor and a scholar?
I'm not sure I was cut out to do this necessarily. I've thought about doing, occasionally now and then, I thought I could have done 20 or 30 other things. And early on, I remember thinking as an undergraduate, and looking out at a professor and thinking, wow, why in the world would somebody want to do that? So at least early on in my life, I was very conscious that teaching at whatever level of education was not something that I wanted to do. And then I think I entered graduate school. I was obviously very interested in the ideas, and I enjoyed writing, I enjoyed research. And so I entered graduate school thinking that it was a very flexible degree, and that I would be involved in some aspect of research or policy. And, one thing led to another, and I took a teaching job, and it's been wonderful. I mean, I really enjoy the freedom. I know for a lot of people, that kind of schedule and that kind of freedom is hard, and some structure makes a little more sense for other people. But I love it. And with respect to law, I mean, I consider myself first and foremost a political scientist, and so kind of an interloper in law schools, where I find myself a lot these days. But I've always been intrigued by the law, in part, I think, because in graduate school, dealing with some kind of very abstract and high-level concepts like democracy, which are, of course, often very contested, for me, it was always welcome to go back to something a little more tangible, a little more concrete, like a written law. So when my dissertation at Berkeley was on the diffusion of democracy, which was really hard to get a handle on unless I actually thought about how that was represented in constitutions. And I think over the years, I've come to recognize that in some ways law is one of the more interesting aspects of what we do, in part because it allows somebody who has a more normative or activist bent to actually engage in some of those issues. And I think, some of the cases in law lend to a much more concrete, much more interesting approach to problems, which can otherwise be a little abstract.
And you've crafted for yourself a career that allows you to be both a scholar, writing at home, and also an advisor, traveling the world, consulting with people, giving advice, helping people to see problems, understand the stakes of implications of the answers to those problems. So you found a way to scratch both itches.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You and I probably do a fair amount of that stuff, and that is really fun and interesting. And it feels like you're making a little bit of a difference. Most of the times, I tell stories about this all the time, that I've been involved in constitutional assistance or advising or consulting. It's never clear to me that advice has ever been taken, at least overtly. So, it can be a little disappointing and a little disenchanting. At the same time, it's nice I always think of what I try to do is just to offer some alternatives and some options, and maybe try to point to some of the consequences of those options, but never delude myself into thinking that I'm necessarily making a difference in some of these domestic processes.
Let's go back to when you were a student, Zach. When you were a student, was there an article or a book, some kind of publication that really influenced you back then and today, continues to this day, to shape and and kind of influence the way you think about your own work?
Well, I've obviously thought about that a little bit before coming to talk to you today. And a couple of the things that occurred to me were, one, when I was an undergraduate, Dahl's polyarchy was very influential. Later on, actually became entranced actually by our colleague Sandy Levinson's book, Constitutional Faith, which is one of the best books out there. And before I launched into my dissertation topic, I was really interested in this book by an economist, Thomas Schelling, Micromotives and Macro Behavior, which in some ways, I mean, it's just this really enchanting book that goes through everything from hockey helmets to some of the behavior involving adjusting a thermostat in the room to the idea of the dying seminar and so on and so on. And it's all about the interdependence of our actions with that of others, and how that results in some ways to these very strange outcomes. And that book led in many ways to my thinking about constitutions and how people are writing constitutions seemingly in isolation, but really together with the rest of the world and many of the prior drafters of constitutions.
Hmm. And still on your work, is there a book or a paper, a chapter in a volume that you hold dearest to you, that is most important to you, perhaps most reflective of your current thinking, or some thinking that you think is important for you or for the field? And I ask that because I'd like to share a link to that work with our viewers and with our readers, and I'll publish that in the blog post when we publish this particular interview.
Well, there's one piece which is a favorite of mine, which I've been thinking about more recently these days in this era of very strong and seemingly pathological nationalism. And that's this piece I did on national identity with Rui de Figueiredo's in the Business School at Berkeley. And, you know, he and I were interested in this interplay, as many social psychologists are, this interplay between pride and prejudice. And just wondering whether really strong in-group pride, whether that's pride in a country or a group or any social entity, whether that also implies prejudice towards the out-group. And there's a lot of social psychology out there, and none of this is really teased it out to our satisfaction. And so we're, for the most part, interested in whether those who are strong nationalists, whether they also have a very ethnocentric, xenophobic side to them. And I think our instinct, our impression is that most of them do. And I was thinking recently by some comments by Emmanuel Macron, who's very famously responded to some of the nationalism out there by saying, well, there's kind of a benign patriotism, which is different from this kind of more malicious and maybe ethnocentric nationalism. And I think that's right. And that's exactly what Rui and I were trying to do in that article. And so we looked at people who expressed high levels of national pride and just tried to see if they were the same people who expressed high levels of anti-immigrant bias. And in general, it's true, that was the case. But what we were able to identify as a strain of national identity, which we and others call patriotism, another strain, which you might call nationalism. And if you separate those two strains and identify people who profess one or the other, you then see that those who express sort of this more benign form of patriotism are no more xenophobic than anybody else. And it was work that it was in some ways presaged by one of our colleagues, Mauricio Viroli, wrote this great book on called For Love of Country that I had identified as more positive strain of patriotism. And it was something that Rui and I were able to tease out and show with these survey data. And I've been coming back to it only because, I mean, the idea has always continued to intrigue me, but it's also very relevant now. And it's one of those pieces that I wish more people read. And so, yeah, I'll send you the link for that and hope that actually happens.
Yeah, please send us a link. It sounds important, and it's certainly timely. And I'm sure our readers will appreciate the chance to read it, and in so doing, to learn more about you. But Zach Elkins, thank you very much for taking the time to visit with us and share with us how you work and how you write and how you think. This has really been great. And congratulations again on the 10-year anniversary of a book that 20 years from now, someone will say that influenced me when I was a student and it still influences me today.
Oh, I can only hope. Well, it's been my pleasure to be here, and I'm always happy to talk to you, Richard. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Zach. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.